Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Corin Grace Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're asking the question of what if desegregation led to a second civil war? Now, I know a lot of people are going to be very disappointed. They were expecting me to do a video on what if McKinley was assassinated. So we're going to do that for next week. But for this week, what we're doing is we're kind of continuing on from our video, which was covered last time, which was what if George Wallace won in 1968. Definitely check that video out. But one of our contributors, Thomas Watson, he made the point that what I should do is I should do alternative history looking at basically, because like the whole issue with regard to desegregation in the South was very, very contentious. Yeah, so it's basically kind of saying the unwritten thing of what a lot of people have kind of been saying, which is basically, what if a second civil war had actually kicked off because of that issue? So that's kind of what we're going to explore with this. But as always, we're going to look through the context of it first. We're going to look through some of the history. Then we're going to talk broadly about how much support this would have had and like where the support might have come from. And then obviously we're going to talk about the alternative history itself. But before we get into any of that, don't forget to obviously hit the like button, share with your friends. Sharing is caring. We have a Patreon account, so obviously don't forget to donate to that. That will really help out the channel. Like this is my full-time job now, so every little bit really helps. And then also as well, obviously subscribe if you haven't already. The channel in the last week or so has really blown up, so really pleased with that. And so let's keep the good times rolling, people. So now when discussing what was one of the main triggers for the civil rights movement, we have to look at the Supreme Court case, which was Brown versus Board of Education, in which, in a rare decision, it's very rare that it's a unanimous decision, but it's a unanimous decision that the prior decision of the court, which had been in Plessy versus Ferguson, if I remember correctly. So in that decision, it said that you could have separate but equal. So white people going to separate schools and black people going to separate schools. But that, you could keep them separate. So whether it's buses or drinking fountains, whatever, you keep them separate, but it didn't necessarily mean that one group had to have better facilities than the other group. However, obviously in practice of these Jim Crow laws across the South, what you'd found is that it was not actually equal. So separate meant inferior. So black people were getting inferior facilities to white people, right? And so it was decided in this unanimous decision that basically we needed to end segregation and particularly needed to end it in public schools. Now, the Supreme Court in this decision said that segregation in schools should be quote unquote phased out with deliberate speed. Now, this was quite a broad thing. It didn't give really much of a timetable and stuff. And so obviously a lot of Southern segregationists basically was like, yeah, we're not going to act on that, right? And so 3 years later, you had the famous Little Rock incident in Little Rock, Arkansas, in which 9 black students tried to apply for university in Little Rock. And this was really opposed by the people there. So much so that it took for President Eisenhower to actually nationalize the National Guard of Arkansas. So each state has its own National Guard, which is a little bit confusing because it's kind of more the state guard. It should be called the state guard. But anyway, so he nationalized the National Guard, which meant that the federal government taking over the administration of the National Guard within Arkansas. And so he basically sent troops in order to safeguard these 9 black students, so that they could actually attend this university. And the governor of Arkansas, in retaliation for this, shut down the public school system. So rather than actually sending white kids to these schools, they basically gave vouchers and sent them to private schools, just so that they wouldn't have to be integrated with blacks, right? And actually this practice was copied amongst many other southern states, right? So this kind of gives an idea of just how firmly people in the South were to opposing these kind of things, the length to which they would go just so that black people and white people wouldn't be sat in the same school. And now fast forward 5 years from the Little Rock incident and 8 years after this Brown versus Board of Education decision, and you had the famous old Miss Riots of 1962. So this is September the 30th into October the 1st of 1962. And basically what happened in this case was James Meredith, who was a student, actually just give an idea of this, right? James Meredith at time of recording is still alive, right? He's 88 years old. So this kind of gives you an idea of just how recent this history is. I know we're kind of talking about it like, oh, it happened a long time ago. This is literally within the lifetime of people, right? The people who are involved in these stories, some of them are still alive. So anyway, James Meredith applied for the University of Mississippi, and he purposely didn't say what his race was until halfway into the application process, at which point the university said that, right, we're not going to admit you. And so he took this decision all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so it was then enforced that he had to go to the university. And what ended up happening in retaliation to this was a massive, massive riot, right? And there was 2,500 people, and and basically they had Molotov cocktails, they had acid, and they were throwing these things at federal marshals, right? So at police and at like soldiers and stuff, yeah, in order to basically dissuade them from being able to have just this one student, right? And by the morning of the 1st of October, there were 13,000 federal troops, yeah, who had been sent there, and in total, it took 30,000 troops to quell this thing. So in all of American history, even to this day, this is still the largest number of troops that have had to gone in to quell an uprising in all of American history, right? It's literally insane, right? And just to give an idea of some of the violence, right? 2 people were murdered. One of them was a French journalist. You had up to 300 people injured, and you had up to 300 people who were arrested, right? And only a third of the people who were arrested were actually attendees at the University of Mississippi. So this is kind of gives an idea of, the whole, lots of people in like the rest of the state, like taking part in this, and even the Ku Klux Klan, were hanging about as well, and probably had a large hand in this. And so, this kind of gives an idea of just how entrenched this was. And Governor Barnett of Mississippi famously said, "We will never surrender to this," right? So this kind of gives an idea of, he's kind of invoking his inner Churchill, over this bloody issue. And then a few months on from this old Miss Riots, you had the famous thing which we discussed in the previous video, which was famously, George Wallace standing in the doorway of the University of Alabama and stopping 2 black students from being able to attend there, right? And this was like a bit of TV theatre. This is political theatre, as they say. And so he famously stood in the doorway. It took for the U.S. Attorney General, Katzenberg, of some his name's on the thing. I've probably just forgotten how to actually say his name. But either way, he goes up to Wallace and basically gives him an order from the president, say you need to move out the way. Wallace still refuses and gives this long speech about states' rights, which should be in the link in the description, if I remember correctly. But anyway, so again, it took for Kennedy to have to nationalize the Alabama National Guard, and that's something we discussed in the previous video as well, about having to literally take over the military of Alabama in order to do this. However, in all of these cases, what we're going to assume with this timeline is that instead of them going down a constitutional route, because Governor Barnett and Governor Wallace, both of them kind of said, well, we'll oppose this in the courts, we'll oppose this at the ballot box and stuff, we'll oppose this constitutionally. But let's assume that people in the South took the same measures as they had in the Civil War 100 years earlier, and it actually seceded from the Union. So that's kind of what we're going to look into here. But before we can do that, we have to look into just how much of a kind of broad base of support such a movement would have had. And so in order to do that, the best kind of litmus test we have for this is basically by seeing the electoral results in different presidential elections at this time. So as we discussed in our previous video of what if Dewey beat Truman in 1948, looking at the US presidential election of 1948, you had the famous dixiecrats. So in Mississippi, you had 87% of people in that state voting for the dixiecrats. You had 80% of people in Alabama. You had 72% in South Carolina. Louisiana had 49%. And then obviously going down to Georgia and all the other places, it's 20% and lower than that. So it kind of gives a bit of indication in terms of these states in the deep South, and these are the same states which split away in the Civil War as well. So kind of gives a bit of indication. And the reason for this is because these were the states in which you had the largest black population, because these were the states where you had the largest former slave population. So that's why the so-called Upper South, which is states like Virginia and Tennessee, etc., they didn't initially join the Confederacy 100 years before this, because it wasn't as big of an issue. The only reason why those states in the Upper South end up joining the Confederacy is because they were opposed to Union troops marching through through their territories. You know, and we can kind of see the same thing here, yeah, in terms of most of the opposition to desegregation. While you had Jim Crow laws across like the whole of like the former Confederacy, it still was a thing where it was really entrenched was in the deep South, you know, and so like states in the upper South were opposed to it, but you know, when it came to it, they just was like, okay, fine, we'll just put up with it, right? And now when we skip forward a few years, yeah, to the 1956 election. Now, this one wasn't as seismic of a kind of election, but it was still worthy of talking about it, right? So this is just 2 years after the Brown versus Board of Education a thing has been done. This is a year before the Little Rock incident. So civil rights at this point is an issue, but it's not even like that much of a hot button issue. And yet even still, one elector in the state of Alabama went towards a white supremacist. And as a matter of fact, the States' Rights Party managed to get 29% of the vote in South Carolina. They managed to get 17% of the vote in Mississippi. They managed to get 7% of the vote in Louisiana. And they managed to get like 6% in Virginia and then 4% in Alabama. So it's quite interesting to note that although support in Alabama was only at 4%, they still gave one of their electors, yeah, like to someone on this states' right ticket. Now we skip forward to 1960, and with that election, right? So again, we see the states' rights party, these unpledged delegates, and it's a little bit more complicated. So in the state of Mississippi, 39% end up going towards like these kind of unpledged delegates. 21% in Louisiana end up going to them, and then Alabama, it's really unclear. You know, depending on which source I see, either says that 0% of people voted for them or that 57% voted for them. Now, I'm guessing it's more than 57%, but it's weird because these unpledged electors, some of them went Democrat, and some of it was, I don't know. So if people in the comment section know a bit more about this and can, because what I could find on like Wikipedia and all these other things, yes, I know you shouldn't use Wikipedia or blah, 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 but I also tried to find like some of the other like statistics on it, and thus far I've not been able to make much sense of it. So if anyone can help me, please do. But either way, it kind of gives a bit of an indication of in that year like the level of support for these kind of parties. And actually, when it came to electoral college, 15 electors went to the states' rights people, right? So you had 8 of them in Mississippi, you had 6 of them in Alabama, and you had 1 of them in the state of Oklahoma. Now we're going to talk about the election of 1964. So this election, there wasn't an out-and-out kind of states' rights kind of like candidate. However, Barry Goldwater kind of took on a lot of this mantle. So although he had been in favour of prior civil rights acts, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was something that he opposed because it was basically infringing on the rights of individual states and also on like private businesses and stuff, right? Such as like hotels and bus companies and stuff. So because of this, that's why he opposed it. However, in this election, people in the South who traditionally up to this point had always voted Democrat, just as a sign of protest against Lyndon B. Johnson, who had obviously signed the Civil Rights Act, they voted for Barry Goldwater as a Republican. So in some of these states in the Deep South, and these Deep South states are the ones that went for Barry Goldwater, we can see that in the state of Mississippi, 87% voted for Republicans. We can see in Alabama, 69% of them voted for Goldwater. In South Carolina, 59%. In Louisiana, 57%. And in the state of Georgia, it was 54%. So again, we can kind of get a little bit of indication of just how much support there was. And in the South, in total, 52% went for the Democrats and 48% went for the Republicans, right? So in this election, you can kind of see that, you know, when you look at like other states outside of the Deep South, it runs at about like 45%, 40%, in some cases like in the 30s. But when it comes to the Deep South, this is where it's a real hot button issue. And so this is where a lot of the support ends up being. And finally, we're going to discuss the presidential election of 1968, as we did last time. For this election, we can see that George Wallace, when he was running for the American Independent Party, which was explicitly a segregationist platform, we can see that he won 66% in the state of Alabama, he won 63% in Mississippi, 48% in Louisiana, 43% in Georgia, and 39% in Arkansas. So, and then obviously like going down each state, it's like less and less and less. But it kind of gives a bit of an idea of, yes, he had a lot of support within the South, and obviously he got 41% of rural Southern voters. He managed to get 32% of middle income people who were urbanites, so like people living in cities who are middle class in the South. He managed to get 32% of that vote. And then when it comes to lower income people who lived in the cities in the South, he managed to secure 25% of that vote. So kind of gives a bit of an indication of just how much support it was. And actually that's the kind of the point of listing out the results in all of these southern states over these different elections. Yeah, is to kind of give a bit of a litmus test in terms of, you know, like how much support, how much groundswell there would be. Yes, obviously if there was a second civil war at this time, not to say that every single person who supported this would have been in favor of secession, but it kind of gives a bit of an idea of just how strongly people supported this. And also as well, obviously, just because people would have voted for other parties, like, doesn't mean that they necessarily would have, you know, it's all a bit complicated, yeah, because obviously just because you voted for someone who's not in the parties that we've kind of advocated, yeah, doesn't mean that suddenly you'd be in favor of desegregation also. So something to kind of bear in mind. It's not the best kind of indication, but it's a pretty good kind of gauge of like the level of support. So now we kind of looked into all of this, now we can kind of ask the question of what would have happened if there had been a civil war at this time. So as always, as we say with this would never have happened. And the reason it would never have happened is because, like, there was so much more going on in the 1960s than the civil rights era. Like, it's like, you know, you had the Cold War, right? And so it's a thing where, first of all, you know, it's 100 years ago since like the last Civil War, and as much as people in the South were like, yo, like kind of the South will rise again, they weren't stupid. They remembered what happened and how much the South was destroyed back then. Never mind how much it would be destroyed now with modern weapons and with nuclear weapons and all the rest of it, right? So there was no chance that like the South was going to come out winning in it, and even more so in the sense of like the institution of Jim Crow was nowhere near as entrenched as the institution of slavery had been like 100 years beforehand. Yeah, so it's a thing where people are not willing to secede from the Union over an issue such as Jim Crow and stuff, right? You know, so, and also as well, the fact that, as we said, most of this support is in the Deep South, so you'd have even less states actually splitting away. You know, like as we can see in like these elections, other than Mississippi and Alabama, and occasionally Louisiana, occasionally Georgia, like most of these states are not consistently kind of voting in this way. You know, so for the most of the part, I think that the only two states that would actually go through the lengths of seceding would be Mississippi and Alabama. And as a side note, even if they got independence, something to note is that these two states routinely end up being the poorest states in the union. They end up being the ones that are most heavily dependent on federal aid, from the federal government, obviously, as we discussed in other videos, gives money to certain states. Mississippi and Alabama would kind of be the worst two states to split away because of how dependent they are. Not to say that in the long term they couldn't have turned this around, but even if magically they managed to split away and then was like, right, okay, we're gonna maintain segregation like kind of like in these two states, and the rest of the country just was like, okay, you two have at it, whatever, even then it wouldn't, yeah, it would be kind of complicated and stuff. But in reality, there is no way that the United States government would just allow these two states to secede. Like, if they hadn't done it in the Civil War before, why would they do it now? And also something to note as well, this is the middle of the Cold War. You know, the riots in Old Miss, this happened literally 16 days before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if you think about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how much the president had to focus on, you know, nuclear weapons in Cuba and like, is there going to be World War III, etc., etc., in the middle of all that, you're going to have a civil war with states splitting away and trying to, like, you know, over like children going into like schools with other people of different races. It's just a bit ridiculous. This would never really have happened. I think that even if they'd start to make movements towards doing this, I think very quickly both the people who were opposed to it and also even the people who were in favour of this would have kind of chilled out a little bit, because they would be like, actually, the wider thing is that we have to bear in mind we're in the middle of a Cold War between freedom and slavery, and, you know, between capitalism and communism, and if we end up like fighting each other over this issue. If we end up descending into a civil war, the only winner of this is going to be the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union is already expanding around the whole world, and they're just going to create even more tensions and divisions and like expand their influence and stuff around the world, and will really play on the fact that America is destroying itself over this issue. The race issue is already something which Soviet propaganda people in like the KGB really hammered home on. Most of their propaganda against America was pointing out the inconsistency of this issue, and as I've said in previous videos as well, race is really the Achilles heel of the Western world. It's really the issue in which it meets the West at its weakest point, because it points out like the greatest level of hypocrisy. So every society, every civilization has its own contradictions and stuff, but when it comes to like the Western world, especially the Anglo-Saxon world, the idea that all men are created equal, and then you have slavery, and then you have segregation, and then even to this day you have like certain elements of like racial discrimination and stuff, right? It kind of flies in the face of that overall narrative, yeah, and undermines like much of that promise. So this is what the Soviets really kind of like focused in on, and when we think of the 1960s, they're already incredibly tense and divisive like kind of era, and so if you had like the hippie movement later on, the Vietnam War, all these kind of things, all of this all tied up within this, it's not going to end well for America. I mean, one thing you could say is maybe America wouldn't have gone into Vietnam as strongly as they did, because if they're trying to like quell a domestic uprising, would they have really been as focused on like communists taking over like Southeast like Asia, like 12,000 miles away? They probably would have just been like, we need to take care of our own country first and then worry about the rest of the world later. So yeah, all of this is kind of, it never would have happened, but just in case it had happened, this is probably what would have happened. It would have just been crushed. It would have led to a lot of tension in America. The Soviets would have got stronger. America would have got weaker. The Cold War would have been very different, in which like the balance of power has shifted far more towards the Soviets. And it wouldn't really happen. But it's always interesting to kind of think about these alternative histories, and as much as people will kind of sometimes dismiss it, it really shows, when it's done well, it shows a deeper understanding of history and understanding just how much of an impact certain things had, right? And understand that wider historical context is why we look at alternative history. So, that being said, if you like this video, as we said, hit the like button, share with people as well, subscribe if you haven't already. We have a Patreon account, so donate to that. This is now my full-time job, so every little helps. Really be appreciated and stuff. We're gonna go into merchandise at some point as well. We're gonna go into different avenues for sponsorships and potentially different platforms as well, just to kind of broaden the message and not to be so reliant on like YouTube and the algorithm. And so the channel obviously has done very well very recently. Like we've like more than doubled our the total viewership in the space of just over a week, because of like the video to do with What If Ireland United. So definitely check that out. And but it just kind of has shown like how no matter what I do, it's kind of out of my hands in terms of whether videos go viral or whether they don't go viral. And it's so anyway, it's YouTube is a good platform, but it's not the only platform. So we're trying to really broaden this thing out as like an actual business, but it's going to take some time. It's going to take a lot of people to support. So every little bit will really help. And anyway, the next video, just waffling about like my shameless plug and stuff, but the next video is going to be on what if McKinley was never assassinated. So this is mainly going to be looking at the effect that Teddy Roosevelt had within his first term, would have even been elected in the election that happened after that. And so it's kind of looking at some of the things of like how America would be different basically without kind of Teddy Roosevelt in that first term. So with that being said, have a great day and bye.